We don't have to go through the niceties today.
That's correct. We're going to go
real
through
conversation.
the amenities. Wait, no, that's too far the other direction.
It's the worst kind of deja vu. I think that's what it's just. Was thinking back the other day to 2016, and you know, it's been what, like 8 years, you know, since then, and it's just incredible how different I feel about it. It was, you know, horrible. I was living in Atlanta at the time in 2016. And so that was an experience, you know. It was already the most culture shock I'd ever had living in the Southeast. I grew up in like the suburbs of Seattle. My mom is originally from the South, and she was like, I'd moved a lot, but she was like, I think that's going to be one that's a little bit more difficult than you think. And she was right. And it just was fueled even more so by the results of that election. Thankfully, I worked with a team and had a manager or a director who was really aware of the impact of that event and gave space to allow people and herself to process it and to, you know, find a way to integrate the new reality with how to do like everyday life, you know, in a real way. And I actually emailed her when we got the election results and was like, I'm just so thankful for the space you held then, because now I realize how much of a gift that was and how that's not the first instinct of every leader, you know, to do that for their team, but that was her first instinct. So it just says a lot about her. And I wanted to tell her that I understand that action in like a much different way now and have even more gratitude. But yeah, it's a strange time to see what's playing out and then, you know, talk about KPIs of an app. So
right.
Yeah, a lot of dichotomy.
Yeah, I feel like the best spin that I can put on it, because I think that's not my initial reaction to put a good spin on it, but my best spin on it is people are hopeful that whatever normal is comes back soon. And so holding on to those normal patterns of, okay, let's talk about the app.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is a way to be grounded in something that is known, is not changing other than changing because you will it to change.
Yeah.
Because you are making design decisions or whatever. And it's just, and I think that's, you know, it is a dichotomy, but it's also like, it both annoys me. Like, I kind of want to be like, all right, everybody just stop what you're doing. Let's go fix this shit. But that's not how things work.
Mm-hmm.
And so giving space to people to have those moments or have those parts of their lives that are mundane, even if it's designing an app or something. I think it makes a lot of sense. But I think that, you know, you were talking about your manager, and it made me think of when I was in the office on September 11th, 2001. And it was about the time that you could, I mean, I'm sure it had been around for a little bit, but to me, it was still a new idea to be able to watch the news live on a computer.
Yeah. Hmm.
And people had everything up and they were watching, and the boss came through and he was like, all right, everybody, meeting time, turn that off. Let's do work. And there's part of me that's like, yep, totally get that. Like, part of me now. At the
Hmm.
time, I thought you're an idiot. Um, but there's part of me now that's like totally understands that. But I think it's the way that it was just like that dismissiveness rather
Hmm.
than the moment of really trying to understand not just what's going on for yourself as a leader, but what's going on for other people, and trying to bridge that, this terrible thing happened.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it a bit. And then let's do this thing that we can have an impact on right now that gives us a sense of normalcy.
Yeah. It's
So,
intention, right? It's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
acknowledgement is powerful. And I think that's the thing that separates. I think it actually winds up separating even the ability of the team to move forward after really difficult events, whether on a macro level or even within the context of work,
Mm-hmm.
and the company. I think being able to acknowledge the potential feelings that are coursing through people and providing the space for those feelings. And then, to your point, saying, and yet, this is what we can do right now.
Yeah.
Um, and I acknowledge all the other things that we've discussed are real and happening and impacting us. And how do we want to both honor that and not fall apart, right? That is hard. That's where leaders are tested in their ability to own that title, right? To
Mm-hmm.
own the titles that we have. And it's not just, who sits in VP, director, whatever, head of whatever roles, but also the roles that people just play within teams, no matter what title you have. Everyone brings a certain energy, and that impacts, the people we're around. How does everyone kind of almost agree to be intentional in the way that they're going to show up in the role they play for the team to help rather than hurt, or put any further weight on anyone. And so that's just the intangibles that matter a lot, but are talked about really seldomly, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like. Um, and I've been thinking a lot about that because it's, especially in working remote, um, the value of some of those roles on teams has shifted, and the ability to like recognize them has changed,
Mm-hmm.
and what they look like is changed, but the need for them I don't think has changed, to the point of like we evolve very slowly. So like, even though society and how things are playing out is changing rapidly, our like physical and emotional needs are still light years behind some of that.
Right.
What's the bridge, like how do we give grace for the fact that like we are physical beings that have a process of learning how to adapt, and that just takes time, right? And also not being dismissive or resistant to what is changing rapidly in our environment.
Mm-hmm.
um I think is like a really hard part about being human right now. And an especially hard part about being a human who, works on or is thinking about or trying to create experiences for groups of people, right? And I think about that as a researcher a lot, even too, where it's like how, at least personally, I feel like I have to think about conducting especially qualitative research has changed because of what people have on them, and how it changes the way that you create like a feeling in a place of safety within the
Mm.
conversation has changed. So yeah, it's
Tell me about that. Like, where do you see the line having been drawn, and where's the difference now?
I feel like, pre-COVID, there was, how the best way to phrase this? Like, people understood the assignment to a degree, of like when they're going in for a qualitative
You mean
interview.
as a participant?
Yeah, as a
Okay.
participant.
Uh-huh.
Like, and so it was kind of like standard speed of trust in terms of conversation, where it's like, if you withhold, I'll withhold. If
Mm-hmm.
if you're open, I'll be open. And wanting, everyone's personality comes through in all the ways that it comes through. Some people like to be seen as clever, some people like to be seen as smart, some people just want to be right.
Yeah.
All the
Yeah.
personalities you
The
run into.
classic. Yeah.
Yeah, the classic archetypes, right, that present themselves in during the pandemic and then post the pandemic. um, there is no shaking that people were confronted with their own mortality. And what that does to people's decision sets and decision making
Mm-hmm.
is dramatic. And so there's been this interesting, almost like two tracks that people are on, where they'll be going down. I feel like, when you're like walking them through, like, tell me your mental model around this idea, concept, experience, etc. And they'll begin to go down the track, I think, of like almost like their pre-COVID frame of thinking. And then there's a hitch. And then we hit a hitch at some point where it's like, but this is actually changing. Or I don't know if I actually like that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have been trying something completely outside of what would have been standards for me, normal, whatever you want to call it. And then they start to describe kind of almost like the impact that that time had on them and how it's changed the way that they think about that, how
Mm-hmm.
it's changed their prioritization and what's important, and or even just brought their awareness, increased their awareness in certain areas to a degree that is now they're having to factor it in when previously it would have never been a thought for them personally. And so it is interesting to have people have like more fluid decision making principles than like I've, at least in my time doing research, than I've seen before, because that was usually pretty locked in for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
We always said like life stage changes, major, events, things like that is when they shift, and that was understood, but it just happened at this large global scale. And it could be stacked on top of those life stage events. And so that is what's interesting to me, and how that influences really like our understanding of what drives engagement, I think, is stale,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, now because of that. Um, and same with like preferences and things like that. And like, I feel like we're starting a little bit from not fully scratch, but a much more novice, area than the many industries I feel like have been communicating or like really acknowledging that we're starting from. So that's been interesting and unique for me of what's changed.
What I think is funny is I think you're right. Two, that all the layoffs over the past 3-4 years, like research is often and
Yeah.
content. I mean, I think everyone kind of feels they're always the first to go, but just because I think a lot of companies think in terms of I can either guess my way forward cheaper and faster in the short term,
Mm-hmm.
or I can rely on things that I've known in the past to still be true in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, there's probably some subset of things. Like I was talking with somebody recently, and we were talking about like shopping cart checkout design
Mm-hmm.
online, and we basically agreed that at this point, for the most part, you can just get a design system, do what everyone else is doing, and you're fine, right? Because
Yeah.
we've sort of solved, not that they can't be better, but we've sort of solved like what a checkout is like.
Yeah.
But I think that's like relative to what's happening throughout the entire flow. That's a micro interaction at best.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And if you are really trying to understand, like, to your point, like how people are making decisions, when they're making decisions, what's important, how do their priorities change based off of what words you're using to describe something versus where they're at in their mental model or where they're at that day
Mm-hmm.
because of something that's going on. And the fact that or not the fact that, but I don't feel like we're really in a time where guessing your way forward is going to work. And
No.
I
Yeah.
know I'm biased, and I know you're biased.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is the time for investing more in research to really understand, like, I would phrase it as how best to serve people.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Um, but
I couldn't agree
yeah.
more. Yeah, I mean, yes, and I'm biased, of course, but to the point of even what we were talking about earlier around like how managers have responded to
Mm-hmm.
moments of macro change, I think brands and companies are no different with consumers. How are the brands in responding to the macro changes, and how do I feel that as a consumer in my experience?
Right.
And that is part of brand familiarity, right? The ability of the brand to continue meeting you where you are is a part of the feedback loop of this is the right product for me, this is the right,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
The
brand for
trust.
me, the trust.
Yeah.
That is a part of the thread. And it feels, and that's what's so, interesting to me. And like, again, I'm biased as a researcher, but it's like to ignore doing the check-in with your consumer so that you continue to maintain the appropriate experience feels like the riskiest thing that you could actually do.
Yeah.
Because in a time of uncertainty, and this consumer is turning to, like we said, think familiarity and experiences and brands that they want to trust. They feel like they should be able to understand the experience of. There's been a discord, and it's like, wait, why is this product or this brand or this interaction not actually working the way that I need it to? And I feel like that is one of the things that has opened up the market actually to a lot of new players gaining market share in like what has traditionally been really hard industries to capture market share in rapidly in the past 3 years, because some brands have been more responsive than others, and in the ways that resonate more with that base consumer group. And yeah, there's no way around. I guess you can guess and get lucky, right? But you still won't understand why you got lucky. And that then makes it hard to replicate into scale and to bake into, protocol. Yeah, it feels really short-sighted to think we just will hunker down and, keep the same old thing going, because it is broken and we all know that. So it's like, to not fix it is then a strange notion,
Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes, too many thoughts trying to come out. There's a part of me that nope, I'm gonna start that one over too. Sorry. We'll fix it in post.
Yeah.
Or future Matthew will leave this in just to mess with myself. This is one of those things where, again, like I understand it and I also don't agree with it.
Yeah.
Where the incentives placed on the people who are in positions to make decisions about what choices to make within a company, so leadership, they're always, not always, but they're often very short term, very short sighted, focused only on profit, or in extreme cases, cutting losses.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than, not to get too woo-woo about it, but harmonious growth.
Yeah.
And not growth in the growth hacking kind of way, but to grow your capabilities as a company, to grow your impact as a company, hopefully positive, in such a way that, again, it just goes back to like, how best can we serve people?
Yeah.
This is the lens that I approach things with. And it is often at odds with the people who are, we need to raise this KPI by 2 points by the end of the quarter, or I'm going to lose my job as the CPO or something. So
Yeah.
I'm going to make decisions based off of that motivation, even though I'm going to get a really nice exit package. But it just is, to what we were talking about when we were messaging about this, the extractive nature.
Oh my goodness. I feel like that's the part where I'm like, oh my goodness, too many thoughts. Like, that's, to me, like even larger, like, topic of research, harmonious research, and what that means and what that looks like. And also, the responsibility, I don't know if that's too heavy of a word, but the responsibility of researchers and research teams and leaders to hold a line on that to some degree. I was a part of this like really wonderful cohort of both academic and, kind of commercial, if you will, like researchers from all over the world. And it was all about, by this group called Pause and Effect, but it was all about trying to reimagine research in a way that is harmonious, where the participant walks away truly also with insights and knowledge that will positively impact their life, similarly to the business. And we all talked about how kind of like cellularly and like intrinsically physically, you can feel the difference in that research. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like after you've had a really great project and it was like, we learned so much at the same time that these people we unlocked showing patterns that people are into themselves, you know, where they're like, I didn't even realize that this was the way I make decisions, you know, and that's really helpful for me
Mm-hmm.
to understand. So it's like, yeah, reciprocal in that nature and also richer because in that sharing back of this is what we're viewing, um, this is what I'm seeing as someone who's, you know, trained to pick up patterns and to assign terms and all these things to the way you make decisions. What does that mean to you? You know, like how does that land with you? How does that resonate? What else does that bring up? That's the layer that really gets to like subconscious, right? Or it gets
Mm-hmm.
to the origin of why some of those behaviors exist. And so it's better research and it's better business, and yet it's rarely done, to the point of it's, you know, it's those projects sadly like aren't the most common, you know, research often that anybody's conducting. And I've really been sitting with the question of why, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, because to that point, again, uh, it's not actually like being a good steward, you know, even of like dollars or time or resources. But there is this productivity bug, I think, is what it's more tied to, right? Of wanting to have the box checked or something to show for areas that people aren't actually curious about. Because I think curiosity, like true curiosity, is required
Yeah.
for those types of products and projects where it's like, we really don't know, you know, the next step beyond what we're proposing or the concepts that we're showing. And that's fine. That's perfect. We're here to learn what the next step is. But when there's already pretty well baked out assumptions, you don't have a lot of curiosity for the other
Right.
routes, right? Like those routes begin to look like problems and liabilities and additional costs. So to your point of like being like, I understand it, but also know that something's off there. That's one of the things that I see. If it's like, yes, researchers and research needs to be tied to outcomes. You know, like it it is important, I think, to understand the impact of what gaining this information means, has
Right.
done, you know? And yeah, also I think research needs to be set up for success in the way of when it's done well, there has to be an openness and a receptivity to the learning that organically comes out of doing the research. And if there's not that space or time, well, no kidding, the impact becomes pretty lackluster, right? Because the richest nuggets might not be used.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's really, I think, difficult to your point about this time now where things move so quick and the amount of growth expected in a short period of time is astronomical. And yeah, it feels artificial also.
Yeah. It's artificial, or at least it feels artificial. I think in large part because to me because the things that are deemed worthy to grow toward are often only deemed worthy because they're really easy to measure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, we can say daily active users or some whatever,
Yeah.
monthly active users, whatever. Um, and we can say, oh, we have a 30% increase in that. Great.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does
Mm-hmm.
that does that equal more revenue? Maybe. Is it the right active users
Yeah.
to help your company grow long term? And I know that there's a lot of it depends here where like you could be a startup that you're trying to get acquired so you don't really care, which is problematic in its own way, but also I understand. Um, and so it's like, to your point about the curiosity, it's like I've had these moments in my career where I've been able to work with people who are open to being changed by the things that we find out through
Mm-hmm.
research. And it isn't always solely generative projects.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's evaluative
Yeah.
projects, but it's that willingness to be like, huh, I did not see that coming.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's go that way then.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
As opposed to this, it's almost, I almost mean this really, but I'm going to say it kind of silly, like it's almost become a trigger word, the word validation.
Mm.
We need to validate that. We need to
Yeah.
validate that. Because all I hear is you want me to set up a project to make sure that your idea is correct.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Tiebreaker.
Yeah.
Often also, right?
Yeah. And it's like A/B testing. Like, but what if they're both shit ideas? One's less shit than another? Great. Let's run with
Right.
that. Great. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And like, yeah, I think, yeah, there's like this beef, that's been going on for forever of like evaluative versus generative research. And it's like, I think that's the root of it to a degree where both are really awesome and necessary forms of research. It's just that when they don't have a good relationship with each other,
Mm-hmm.
there becomes gaps. It's just Swiss cheese, where it's like you've evaluated something that we have no basis of understanding on. That's not great, and similarly with not doing evaluative research on qualitative findings, it's like, okay, how much should we be spending on creating this experience? Like, how much does it really impact people? Does that resonate across multiple groups? All of these things, that is important learning to
Mm-hmm.
get. And so, they need to be siblings, like it's like we're all a part of the same family. And when one is hurt, the other also is impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think sometimes it operates that way, but yeah, I do think that the openness of stakeholders, and also what I haven't transparently 100% figured out is like the balance even of being the researcher and pushing back, and when to, like that's a
Yeah.
delicate dance as well, to be a good collaborator and to be seen as someone who's open to working, across the organization, across teams, and to also be like, and you hired me for a reason.
Yeah. You hired me
And
to be the expert on this?
yeah, and
Allow me.
to
Yeah.
help you see what's unseen. So please let me do that, is a delicate dance.
Well, I think my guess is you partially just answered the question I'm about to ask, but not to get overly academic. What is the role of a researcher within the context of a business trying to survive or be successful?
I mean, I've always viewed it, and AHISMA principle is like we want no harm for animals, but I've always seen it as kind of like a canary, and that's why I call my freelance stuff, Canary Insights, but it's to be the resource that's always paying attention to how the integrity of the brand, the experience, the product, etc., is changing and how the environment is responding to that change. I think it's to, like there has to be, it's the part of the business that feels the external a bit more than like anyone else, and kind of lives half in that world and half in this internal world. But yeah, you're the part of the org that's sensing what is not maybe even yet tangible in the financials or the trending numbers or any of that. It's just saying something is changing in people, the people who we serve, to your point. And this is how we think that is going to impact the work we're doing, the products that we're trying to launch, all that stuff. I think it's to be that go between, and that's where it's like, if you send someone out, you have to receive them when they come back into the village, like with the knowledge of what they've seen and what they've experienced and all of that. Or when they start chirping, to the canary illustration, you don't muzzle the canary, and say, whatever, like, I don't know why they're chirping. So I think that is the role, and to honor, to a degree, I think also what's true about the experience of the people that you're serving, because it is incredibly difficult to be the innovator for a new thing and to not become biased, right? And so
How do you mean? Say more about that.
Living and breathing something means you understand it to a degree that the average person's not going to. And that is what allows you to take, hopefully, the information from researchers, from, whatever inspiration, other industries, and to make something new, to evolve an experience, a product, whatever. If you weren't entrenched in that space, you probably couldn't do that really well. You wouldn't know what needs to remain, and you wouldn't know what needs to change.
I see. Okay.
Based off of anecdotal information. But it also can, I think, sometimes make you a little bit, it can make it harder to see the full experience of the people that you're serving, and not want to push the agenda, and to say, you need to get here faster, you need to be willing to accept this now, and to understand the pacing is I think sometimes hard for that position. And I think that's the other job of the researcher, to say, this now, this later, this is the rate of absorption, and that is different by each consumer group, and based off of what's happening in the macro climate and all these things. And so that's also a really important part of, I think, what you have an understanding of, is just like how much people can take on, how much new people can take on at a given time, and when they're most receptive, and when they're really not receptive, and shoring up the experience is going to be more received than changing it,
Yeah, it's you just said this now, this later.
Yeah.
And the way I'm interpreting that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the way I'm interpreting that is research should have a perspective.
Oh, yeah.
Is that yes?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think, the thing that I have been, that I would, if out of all the things I really would love to master about whatever my research, it is one, the experience of conducting the research, like the actual questions, the actual experience of interviewing, moderating, etc. But it's also that. It's also taking that information and being able to translate it into that internal world with a really crisp and clear perspective. So that it's almost like a compass, where it's like, I can't tell you the exact coordinates, but I can tell you if you're going north, south, east or west, and what that means potentially. And I think that's really important because, like I said, who else is really going to give that information? Otherwise, it moves at the speed of the business, right? Like, it's just what you can do the fastest. It's what someone else is doing, maybe even what Wall Street is dictating, whatever the case may be, right? But we don't know what level of risk that is or how successful that might be if you don't, again, bring in the end user, right? And to say, well, but this is how our consumers are different than that brand's consumers, even though we play in the same space. The experiences are very different. And having the knowledge and the both data and also verbatim and qualitative stories to explain that and help people digest how to create a roadmap, right? Basically, based off of your research, I think is like the difference between successful and non-successful product launches and organizations.
I don't know where to sort of make the map of this, but when I was starting out in my career, it was really drilled into us by multiple sources that research should remain as neutral as possible.
Mm-hmm.
We're just here to tell the facts of what we found out within the scope of what we're looking at. And then it was, well, you can suggest things, right? So like a researcher report would be like, here's what we found out. Here's like a top quote. And there'd always be a section at the end that said suggested next steps, right?
Yeah.
You might want to move this button to the top or things like that. And I think there are spaces where that's appropriate, particularly if research is new to an organization and is coming, I'll say grassroots. It has to sort of carve out its own space rather than it's coming from the top down. We're going to do this. We're going to build it up and support it.
Yeah.
And so I think you tend to have to make smaller steps and not ruffle feathers as much.
Yeah.
But I also think that, again, bias, but I've also seen it in action, so I think I'm right, is I think research should be driving the roadmap, the product service roadmap.
Yeah.
Not alone, but a key player in what the company focuses on and in what order they do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that partnership, I've been really fortunate to work with some really great PMs, product managers, and even like like architects, like system architects and things like that, who do get the richness and like how to leverage research. And it is always difficult. It is the challenge. It's, it's fun actually coming into an organization where that's new, and to really show how this can work and the impact that it can have. And to your point, I think it's understanding also like the success metrics. So that's a learning curve of like
Mm.
every organization is different. What success then therefore looks like is different. And so,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, it your current, you could maybe increase things so that current users really like the app a lot more or something like that. But if the organization is dictated by growth, like growth is what equals success, then it's
Right.
nice. It's a nice to have that existing users like it more. It's what they wanted is for more new users to come on the app, or something
Right.
like that. But yeah, I think that, to the objectivity thing, like that is also originally what I was told. But I feel like what's interesting of how that's kind of unspokenly morphed a little bit over time is one, how are you a human being completely objective?
Mm-hmm.
Also in the real reality of like, you're a part of this tribe. That is not, that is also a fact, right? And so to show up, I think that's the piece to like where I'm talking about the difference in conducting some interviews too that I mentioned earlier. It's a little bit disingenuous to show up and say like, I don't care what you think about this thing, or like to not um be transparent around like, this is the reason we're talking to you, and that, yeah, I do have an objective and an intention, but I'm also here to with the understanding that I only know so much on this, and I want you
Mm-hmm.
to tell me what I don't understand about this thing. I think it actually just tends to go better when that's much more transparent, because you have your biases about being a part of this tribe and what that means, and like, you do live in that world more of the time than out, in the other world. And so it's almost like the check and balance within the research itself for the external group, the consumers, to tell you, well, you might think that way about this, but this is how I think about it,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what I actually see about it. And we might be talking to ourselves on some things, right? And it's like, nope, I'm not picking that up at all. And you'll learn that from them. And to have that be transparent, I feel like I've gotten at least more honesty in
Mm-hmm.
those responses than when they're unsure of what you are looking for, um, they kind of dance, especially some personalities, they kind of dance around their responses to try to see what lands with you,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and sometimes if they can't find that, it doesn't create safety again with the
Yeah.
participant with you. And they kind of like close up in the conversation. So yeah, of course, sometimes you cannot share, certain aspects of things, but people are smart, everyone looks
Mm-hmm.
up everything. I think in this age, being more transparent than that, like, black box, I'm just gonna observe you ambiguously in this space and like not tell you
Yeah.
what's going on. People are kind of spooked by that. I feel like now, like they're like, okay, this feels like maybe some shady stuff is going on. So yeah, I think that's also like an interesting new balance challenge of like, everyone has the world on their phone.
Mm.
You don't think that they're going to start searching things about what you're saying, or like whatever. I don't even know if that's realistic, especially in virtual research now. So
Mm-hmm.
many people open up a browser in the middle of a conversation, like, um so yeah, that's a change as well.
I think for me, it's always been, excuse me, the transparency is always something that was instilled, at least for me from the start,
Yeah.
about, this is why we're here. You, the participant, are the expert. I'm here to learn from
Yeah.
you. Here's the scope of what we're talking about today. I would say enough. It happens often enough to casually say, almost always, we go outside that scope. It's okay.
Yeah.
I know it's rough for some researchers to have participants go outside their scope, but whatever. Sometimes I firmly believe that sometimes participants just need to say their piece about something before you can actually get to the reason you're there. And sometimes the piece that they say is going to be interesting enough to potentially do something about later.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So let the conversation go where it goes. But I think for me, the question, and I know what the answer is, but the question often, or for me, I know what the question is, ultimately, who am I working for?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a different way of saying that is, who am I representing?
Mm-hmm.
And there's an aspect of me that is representing the company, because I wouldn't be there without the initial ask of go find out about this stuff. But ultimately, where I come down on, or the side I come down on, and maybe this is a false dichotomy, that I work for the participant.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, or I'm responsible for their health and well-being during this time that we're talking, but also I'm become the voice internally for what they have to say, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me it's like I've always felt like part of the purpose of research is ultimately one to go out and generate or coalesce a perspective to then bring back into the organization and fight for.
Yeah.
Versus take a perspective out and go put that on people, and have those very limited conversations that just aren't very fruitful.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, to the point of like going out, even if you are going out, with a perspective, and when you put it on people, it's allowing them to then do what they do with what you've given them, is also it for me, right? Where it's like, if they shake it off and throw it back at you, great. That's the learning, right? Like, this is how people responded to when we put them in this environment that we're thinking of creating, right? Or whatever. And just being brutally honest about the response and giving them the free license to react the way that they react, right? To what you're to showing. And that's where, like, I 100% agree that I also feel like I'm like the representative of these people to leaders in the company, to say, I know that's the way we see it internally, but this is the way this group of people saw it.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we find the middle ground of how they understand things to be right now, and what internally we feel like moves them in an even better direction, potentially. Because people love to use that quote, right, of like, from that was attributed to Ford, of like, if you ask people like, what they want,
faster horse thing.
Faster horse. And it's like, okay, yeah, I get your point. Like, taking some, things at exact verbatim is not best practice. Got you. That's the whole reason you have to have curiosity and a level of expertise to see what's beyond the quote, the direct quote, and how that applies to the business. They don't know your business like you know your business. That's 100% true. They're just telling you where the touch trees are, right, in the forest for them. This matters. This matters more than that. This is what I don't want you to change. This is what, and that's all that's telling you is where there's hesitancy, where there's receptiveness, where there's openness, all of those things. So it's literal and it's also, a bit subjective. And that's where it's like, let's just be a little bit more creative, people. Come on. But
Yeah,
yeah.
creative and get to the core of things. Like,
Yeah.
I know the faster horse thing is whatever, but like if you came back and said, well, people said they want faster horses. My question is, why?
What does that mean? Yeah.
What does that mean? And it doesn't mean that they really want faster horses. Maybe they do. Can we make those? No, we can't. Maybe we can. I don't know. But that's not the kind of business we're in.
Yeah.
Like getting, again, is like leaving time, making time to get to the core that's behind these verbatim statements, right?
Yeah.
Of I want a faster horse. Tell me more about that. Like, what goals are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, that's where research can come in and really be helpful.
Yeah.
Especially if the researchers in question are ones who, in my mind, are going to come back from those far lands, who left, what would you say, left the village?
Yeah, who leave the village.
I guess researchers are bards or something, or
yeah,
who wander around. But and then come back and have a strong perspective about what the need for change is and how to go about changing it.
Yeah. And that is where partnership does come in, like you can come back and say, it's like people said they want a faster horse. I don't think it's about the horse. I think it's about faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go from there? That is where, like, also I feel like how debriefs have been and like synthesis sessions, that's something that I feel like still virtually is very much being figured out, because the richness that sometimes came out of, I feel like, those in-person synthesis sessions where you're, all the cliche sticky notes everywhere, on the walls in the room, was the melding of minds of what does faster mean, right? And being able to really flush out a lot of different ideas in combination of information from people who went out and talked to people and the expertise and understanding, right, of people who solely live in the village to say, this is how that makes sense for us. And does that honor the desire that we heard? And I feel like that's when magic really happens, and you come out of research with ideas that people are, one, excited about, but also just understand. I think that's the other part that's really hard, is it can be without some kind of melding time between, this is what we heard, this is what we think that means, what does that mean for us? I think there's not it doesn't feel natural or intrinsic to people sometimes what the recommendations or the perspectives from research are being presented to them. And that's something I also want to get better at, of like, that's where I feel like pushback often comes, right? Where it's like you give recommendations and they're like, ugh, what does that actually mean? And now it's research again, right? It's research within your company, village, whatever, and to say, they don't understand that is a gap in our collective or cultural currency here. So we have to dial it back even further. We have to go back deeper into the research, and we have to bring some stories forward because some education's needed of even what I mean by this
Mm-hmm.
recommendation, right? And there's into your point around having to allow for like space and time for that sometimes requires like several readouts, or like, or like you have to have follow-ups and things like that, and tight project timelines sometimes don't allow for that, or it's seen as a failure if that has to happen. Like we need to spend an additional week putting together the stories that really enrich now what clearly was not understood,
Mm-hmm.
totally about the recommendations, when I think that that's actually really good knowledge. It's like, okay, this is kind of a foreign topic to us. We need to get better at that if we're going to make a good experience in this area. So let's spend the time getting better at understanding this unmet need space, or whatever. Um, that only benefits everybody. It
Mm-hmm.
only benefits the end, result also. But it's like, how do we get past seeing that as some kind of failure, or
Yeah,
unnecessary, is the other part that I think is going to evolve, and maybe AI will is going to help change that as well. I don't know.
maybe. I think what you're describing, and if I'm wrong, correct me, but it sounds a lot in roughly in the vein of stakeholder management, right?
Yeah.
And it's how do I share this perspective in such a way that it's going to have an impact and make a change that is positive and reduces harm as much as possible? And I think the only way to do that is to basically treat your stakeholders as research participants
Yeah.
so that you understand what their agendas are, what their motivations are, what their risk tolerances are. And so that when you come back from the field to tell the stories that you've learned, you're contextualizing them in such a way that they resonate better based off of those motivations and barriers and capabilities and all the things that we talk about with participants and with end users. Like,
Hmm.
um, not that stakeholders are, I don't mean treat them as research subjects, but I think it means spending as much time understanding them
Hmm. Hmm.
as we spend understanding the customer, the consumer,
Yeah.
whoever, however you want to frame that. And I think for me, I don't, I don't look at what you've described as a failure. Maybe it's a miscalculation
Hmm.
that you can recover from by going back and recontextualizing in such a way that it makes sense to the audience. But I honestly think where the failure of research is, or researchers, is not taking that stakeholder relationship as seriously as it takes the participant relationship.
Yeah, and that's what I really mean by that, where it's
Okay.
it's relationship building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And um when something doesn't resonate, just like in any relationship, there is a level of work needed to understand why and what to do moving forward, right? And so, to your point, it is more complicated, I think, than oftentimes the relationship, even with the end user, is, because it's ongoing.
Yeah.
Like, hopefully it's long term in some regard. And so that is ever evolving, just as the product and the company and the end user is. And so that's where, again, this, like, as a researcher, having these like tentacles, almost out into these spaces to sense, ooh, there's a little bit, I need to spend more time understanding this space, or I sense some changes happening over there,
Yeah.
is probably, I think, like the biggest skill set, right? Is to understand where to put energy and time into what to do research or get some understanding or perspective on is the other side of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that to me is also the part that is, you know, is more art than science, you know, if you will, of knowing when to spend more time understanding the stakeholders, and then also when to spend, say, like, no, we need to spend more time understanding this need area or this
Mm-hmm.
consumer base or something like that. So yeah, it's fighting for those things equally.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch gears.
Yeah.
It's time for 7 plus or minus 2 questions.
Okay, I can't wait.
I'm I'm going to ask you some questions. There is no boundary or guardrail on any of these things. You don't have to answer professionally. You don't have to answer personally. Whatever you feel is the right answer to the question is the right answer to the
Okay.
question. He said, putting his researcher hat on. You're the expert. I
Yeah.
just have the questions. All right. Question 1. What is something you did recently that went really well?
Oh my goodness. Uh First trip with a new friend group. I feel
Okay.
like that's, you know, just like launching something can be precarious. um, you're seeing people in real time respond to your understanding of them, your understanding of where the relationship is, you know. So, yeah, I went on a trip. I've been in uh, getting certified to be a yoga teacher, and I went out with a bunch of friends from that training to just like an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere, essentially in central Washington, and it was incredible. It wound up being so nice, and everyone gelled really well, and
Mm-hmm.
so it felt nice that we all pulled that off and that it was a positive experience.
That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Next one. What do you wish people cared more about?
The quality of their personal lives. I think that sometimes we put those KPIs and like the priorities of all these other things and swirling around our lives ahead of our own, the quality of our own life. And I wish people cared a little bit more about that. I think it would change the decisions we make.
Can you elaborate on that?
So I think it's kind of like goes to the point of like, what is normal to you? What is
Mm-hmm.
accepted? Why are we okay with some of the things that have been normalized? So it's like the quality of our food, the quality of our air, the quality of our relationships, the current ratio of time we spend working to living our own
Mm-hmm.
lives. Like, how did those things come to be? You know,
Right.
how is it that we spend more time, you know, maybe on external agendas than the agendas or the relationships that are um, directly tied to our well-being? You know, not that those are also relationships, right? But it's like 3 degrees out versus 1 degree. You know, like,
Mm-hmm.
why is so much time being spent on the outside of the circle?
Yeah. The thought that comes to mind based on that description is air quotes around this word selfishness in pursuit of better civilization. Like
Yeah.
taking care of yourself. This is the put your mask on first kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you are taking care of yourself in ways that are correct and true and healthy, it will necessarily mean that you have time and attention and capability to give back when it's
Yes.
time and
Mm-hmm.
when it's appropriate to give back.
Yeah. I think that kind of to the what we talked about like organic versus kind of like jet fueled growth. I think it has the same feeling to me where learning how to take care of people at first in a micro context, I do believe helps you then to understand it can grow then in a more natural way to like you're able to take better care of more people the more time that you spend on those
Mm-hmm.
initial relationships. To do it the other way around doesn't seem to work. I feel like where it's like to go from to try to take care of everyone and then come home at the end of the day and be like, okay, I'm going to take these principles and apply it to these really individual specific relationships. I feel like is missing the mark.
Mm. Yeah. All right. Next question. What's your go-to dish when you are going to share food with people
Oh,
that you make?
I make garlic scallops, like these.
Yes.
Yeah, like I pan sear on like a cast iron garlic scallops, and then I'll make just like some like um really simple like lemon buttered linguine or something to go with it, or maybe like
Mm-hmm.
wild rice and asparagus or whatever's kind of the mood. But some kind of seafood, like yeah, the scallops or salmon.
Mm-hmm. Scallops, notoriously difficult to get right. What's your secret
You got to
or
get them
technique? What's your
dry.
technique?
You got to get them very dry. So like I make sure to like really get the liquid off of the top and bottom surface, salt it, get some liquid out again. Um, and then it's about time from pan to plate and to when it's being enjoyed. So
It's the last
the
thing.
last
Yeah.
thing I make. Yeah. And then you have to just like, again, it's a, you know, a little bit of a skill from the job that leaks in. It's about the feel. So you should never be prying it off the pan when it's ready. It'll
Yeah.
tell you when it's
Yeah.
ready, you
Yeah.
know? And so it's just having an eye and a sense for that is also the key, but and making sure like you know there's too hot and then there's the perfect amount of heat, so I do like keep track of. I don't have like any fancy gadgets, like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes this is where the risk for how it turns out is goes like I can usually sense by the way that water dances off the skillet if it's too hot or if it's the right temperature. But yeah, I know you can get those like thermometer guns and things like that to track the temperature, but I'm not there yet.
It doesn't sound like you need to go there.
Yeah,
You,
I
you
think the
gotta,
fun of it
yeah.
is to like sense it, you know, a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, but that's where I'm more researcher than engineer, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, next question. What is the business value of empathy?
Oh, sustainability. I think without empathy, it's hard to maintain relationships, and isn't everything some kind of relationship? So if you can't feel and seek to understand and care about the person, the people on the other side of the table, the aisle, I don't know how you will be successful for a very long time. you might be able to be successful for a short period of time just out of simple need, and a gap that you're serving in the market. Like, if there's not another choice, then yeah, you'll be successful, right? But as soon as people have the choice, they choose what feels good. So if that experience doesn't feel good, then eventually you will become obsolete. And I think that that's like very much correlated to the empathy and the intention of your business. There's no cheating that, I don't think, in the long run.
Cool. All right, next question. Waving at flaggers, yes or no?
It depends on the day. Like, in the Northwest, I don't know if I'd want to wave on like a pouring rain, gray day when I'm out, if I'm out there and it's like, hi, like, thanks for doing it. But I generally, talk to, wave to, try to engage a little bit human with everyone. So I'd probably do it more than not.
Okay. There's no wrong answer to any of these questions. Yeah. All right, last question. Imagine that it's a year from now. What do you hope to not be carrying anymore?
A year from now, what do I hope to not be carrying? I think maybe some uncertainty on what I can do to make my immediate world better during this time. I hope I have more clarity on, at least clarity, if not like making tangible actions on how I want to dedicate, follow my own advice, how I want to dedicate my time to things in my personal world, and how I hope that impacts the community and the people around me.
Okay. The end.
The end, that's it. That's a great question to end on.
Yeah, let's stop talking.